The blood-red sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek as Delilah Caldwell stepped off the dusty stagecoach, her worn leather boots hitting the dirt with a finality that matched the resolve in her eyes. Every head in the small Wyoming town turned to watch her arrival, not because strangers were uncommon in 1876, but because women who traveled alone, especially those with fire in their eyes and a revolver strapped to their hip, were a rarity worth noting. Delilah adjusted her simple blue cotton dress, brushed the trail dust from her sleeves, and lifted her chin against the curious stares. 6 months ago, she'd been the respectable daughter of a Boston merchant. Now she was here, in this frontier outpost, with nothing but determination and the deed to a small plot of land her late father had purchased in a moment of Western ambition. The stagecoach driver tossed down her single trunk. "Madam, you sure this is where you want to be? Willow Creek ain't exactly welcoming to city folk." "I'm sure," Delilah replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. After her father's death, and the subsequent discovery that his business partner had swindled them out of nearly everything, this land was all she had left. She'd sell it and start over somewhere else, somewhere civilized. Suit yourself. The driver tipped his hat and climbed back onto his perch. "Hotels down the street if they've got room. Otherwise, the saloon rents rooms upstairs." As the stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust, Delilah became acutely aware of how alone she was. The main street stretched before her, lined with weathered wooden buildings. Men in dusty clothes moved about their business, while women in practical frontier dresses hurried along with baskets or children in tow. She straightened her shoulders and grabbed the handle of her trunk. It was heavier than she remembered, and she struggled to drag it through the rutted dirt of the street. "Need some help with that, miss?" The voice came from behind her, deep and rough-edged like stone on stone. Delilah turned to find herself staring at the chest of a tall man in a worn leather vest. She took a step back and looked up. His face was tanned and weathered beneath the shadow of his hat, with eyes the color of a summer storm. A thin scar traced from his left temple to his jaw, white against his sun-darkened skin. "I can manage," she said, more sharply than she intended. The stranger raised an eyebrow. "Didn't say you couldn't, just offering a hand." Something in his tone, not condescending, just matter-of-fact, made Delilah reconsider. "I apologize. That would be kind of you, Mr. Wilder, Xavier Wilder." He touched the brim of his hat. "Folks just call me X, Delilah Caldwell." She released her trunk, watching as he lifted it with ease. "I'm looking for the land office and a place to stay for the night." Xavier nodded down the street. "Land office is there with the green door. As for staying, the hotel's full up with railroad men. Saloon's your best bet unless—" He hesitated. "Mrs. Patterson sometimes takes in respectable women. Her place is behind the church." Delilah noted the emphasis on respectable. "Thank you, Mr. Wilder. I'll inquire with Mrs. Patterson first." They walked in silence, Delilah conscious of the curious glances they attracted. Xavier Wilder was clearly known here. People nodded to him with a mixture of respect and wariness. "You planning to settle in Willow Creek?" he asked, breaking the silence. "No. I've inherited some land nearby. I intend to sell it and return east as soon as possible." Xavier's mouth twitched. "Not fond of the West, then?" "I haven't seen enough of it to form an opinion," Delilah replied diplomatically. "But my life is in Boston." "Was in Boston," he corrected, his voice low. Before she could respond, he stopped in front of a neat white house. "Mrs. Patterson's place." "I'll wait to make sure she's taking boarders." Mrs. Patterson turned out to be a plump widow with sharp eyes and a kind smile. After assessing Delilah with a frankness that would have been offensive in Boston society, she agreed to rent her a room. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Wilder," Delilah said as Xavier set her trunk inside the doorway. He tipped his hat again. "Land office closes at 5. Better hurry if you want to see them today." The land office was exactly where Xavier had said, a cramped space smelling of tobacco and old paper. The agent, a thin man named Prescott, adjusted his spectacles as he searched for the deed information. "Caldwell, you say?" "Yes, here it is. 20 acres along Silver Creek. Your father bought it sight unseen 3 years ago." He unrolled a map on his desk. "It's here about 5 miles northeast of town." Delilah leaned forward. "Is it good land? What might it be worth?" Prescott hesitated. Well, it's got water, which counts for something. But it's rocky in parts. Might fetch $300 from the right buyer." It was less than she'd hoped, but enough for a train ticket east and a modest fresh start. "How soon could it be sold?" "That's the thing, Miss Caldwell. You'd need to inspect it first, sign some papers declaring its condition. Legal requirement for absentee owners." He rolled up the map. "I can arrange for someone to take you out there tomorrow." Back at Mrs. Patterson's, Delilah picked at her supper, mind churning. One day to see the property, perhaps another to complete the sale if a buyer could be found quickly. She'd be on her way within a week, back to civilization and away from this dusty, primitive place. "More stew, dear, Mrs. Patterson offered, already ladling it into Delilah's bowl without waiting for an answer. "Thank you. This is very good." Delilah took a bite to be polite. "Mr. Prescott mentioned I'll need to visit my father's property tomorrow." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted subtly. "Out by Silver Creek. You'll need a proper guide. The trails can be confusing. Mr. Prescott said he'd arrange something." HMPH. The widow sat down heavily. "He'll likely send young Jimmy Ford, who gets lost going to his own outhouse. You ask for Xavier Wilder. He knows every inch of this territory." Delilah remembered the tall man with the storm-gray eyes. "He seems capable, but why would he agree to guide me? He guides for the army sometimes, maps the territory, and he's decent, despite what some say." Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. "There's been trouble with outlaws lately. A woman traveling alone needs someone who can handle trouble." That night, Delilah lay in the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town. Somewhere a piano played in the saloon, and occasionally laughter or a shout would carry on the night air. So different from Boston's genteel dinner parties and theater outings. Her father would have loved it here. He'd always had a romantic notion about the West, even as he spent his life behind a merchant's counter. Morning brought clear skies and Delilah's first full view of the mountains in the distance, their peaks still snow-capped even in late spring. She dressed in her most practical outfit, a brown skirt, white shirtwaist, and sturdy boots, and headed for the land office. Mr. Prescott was already there, arguing with a familiar figure. Xavier Wilder stood with his back to the door, but Delilah recognized the set of his shoulders and the worn leather vest. "I'm telling you, Prescott, Jimmy Ford couldn't find his way across a creek with a map and a compass." Xavier's voice held a controlled anger. "You send him out with a lady from back east and you're asking for trouble. And I'm telling you, Wilder, that I've already arranged." Prescott caught sight of Delilah in the doorway and stopped mid-sentence. "Miss Caldwell, good morning." Xavier turned, surprise flickering briefly across his face before he composed his features. "Miss Caldwell." "Good morning, gentlemen." Delilah stepped into the office. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Prescott said smoothly. "I was just explaining to Mr. Wilder that I've arranged for Jimmy Ford to escort you to your property today." "Actually," Delilah said, drawing on her experience negotiating with her father's suppliers, "I was hoping Mr. Wilder might be available." Mrs. Patterson speaks highly of his knowledge of the area. Xavier's mouth twitched with what might have been amusement. I'd be happy to oblige if you're comfortable with my company. Wilder's services don't come cheap, Prescott said quickly, his tone sharp. I can pay a fair rate, Delilah countered. No charge, Xavier said, his eyes still on Delilah. I'm headed that direction anyway. Prescott's face reddened slightly. Very well. I'll have the papers ready for your return, Miss Caldwell. He thrust a folded map toward Xavier. The property lines are marked. Outside, Delilah turned to Xavier. Thank you. I hope I didn't impose. You didn't. He unfolded the map, studied it briefly, then refolded it and tucked it into his vest pocket. Jimmy Ford is the undertaker's son. Good kid, but he'd have you lost before noon. He nodded toward the livery stable. Do you ride, Miss Caldwell? Yes, though it's been some time. An hour later they were headed out of town, Delilah perched somewhat uncomfortably on a gentle mare named Daisy, while Xavier rode a sturdy buckskin gelding. The land opened up before them, rolling hills giving way to rocky outcroppings and stands of pine trees. Have you lived in Willow Creek long, Mr. Wilder? Delilah asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. 5 years. Came west after the war. His clipped answer discouraged further questions about his past, so Delilah changed direction. What can you tell me about the land we're going to see? Xavier glanced at her, seeming to assess her sincerity. It's rougher than Prescott let on. Good water source, but the soil's thin in parts. Previous owner tried ranching, gave up after 2 hard winters. Delilah's heart sank. So it won't be easy to sell. Didn't say that. Railroads coming through. Land with water is valuable even if it's not for ranching. He guided his horse around a rocky patch. Why are you so set on selling? Most people come west to start something, not cash out and leave. I didn't choose to come west. My father died and this land is all that's left of his estate. I need to sell it to support myself. No family back east to help you. No, just me. Delilah kept her eyes on the trail ahead, not wanting him to see the emotion that threatened to surface. My mother died years ago, and my father's business partner cheated us out of almost everything else. Xavier was silent for a long moment. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Caldwell. Something in his tone made her look at him. The hardness in his face had softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of genuine compassion. Thank you, Mr. Wilder. They rode on, the landscape growing wilder and more beautiful with each passing mile. Despite her determination to dislike this untamed country, Delilah found herself captivated by the vastness of the sky and the way the sunlight played on the distant mountains. By midday, they reached a creek that cut through a small valley. Xavier dismounted and helped Delilah down from her horse. This is Silver Creek. Your property starts here and extends up through those trees. Delilah walked to the creek's edge, surprised by the clarity of the water as it tumbled over smooth stones. It's lovely. There's a small cabin up the rise, Xavier said, pointing to a cluster of pine trees. Might be in rough shape, but we can take a look. The cabin turned out to be sturdier than expected, a one-room structure with a stone fireplace and a small covered porch. The door hung askew, and leaves had blown inside, but the roof appeared sound. Previous owner was a man named Hargrove, Xavier explained as they explored the dusty interior. Left after his wife died of fever. Good man, but the place held too many memories. Delilah ran her hand along a crude wooden shelf built into one wall. Despite the dust and abandonment, she could sense that this had once been a home. A real home where someone had lived and loved and dreamed. It would take work to make it livable again, she mused aloud. Xavier gave her a curious look. Thought you were keen on selling. I am. She wasn't sure how to explain the strange tug she felt toward this place. I'm trying to assess its value." They ate a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices that Xavier had packed, sitting on a fallen log near the creek. The sun warmed Delilah's face, and the sound of water flowing over rocks created a peaceful melody. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked suddenly. "What's that?" "Losing someone you love. Does the pain ever fade?" Xavier was quiet for so long that Delilah thought he might not answer. "It changes," he finally said. "Becomes part of you like a scar. Some days you hardly notice it. Other days it aches something fierce." He tossed a pebble into the creek. "Lost my younger brother at Gettysburg. My folks a year later, influenza. Some days it feels like yesterday." "I'm sorry," Delilah said, understanding now why he'd been compassionate about her father's death. "My mother died when I was 16. I thought nothing could hurt worse until I lost my father, too." A companionable silence fell between them, a shared understanding that needed no words. After a while, Xavier stood and suggested they ride the property line to get a full sense of the land. By late afternoon, they had explored all 20 acres. Delilah was surprised to discover a small apple orchard, overgrown but still bearing fruit, and a cleared area that had once been a vegetable garden. The more she saw, the more she could picture what this place had been and perhaps could be again. "What do you think it's worth, honestly?" she asked as they prepared to head back to town. Xavier considered the question seriously. "To the right buyer, maybe $400. The water rights alone are valuable, but it might take time to find that buyer." It was more than Prescott had suggested, but still a modest sum. "And what would I need to do to make it livable if I were to stay?" Xavier looked at her sharply. "Are you considering that?" "I'm exploring all options," Delilah replied, not entirely sure why she'd asked. The idea of staying had crept into her mind unbidden. "The cabin needs work, new door, windows repaired, chimney cleaned. You'd need supplies, livestock if you want to farm. It's not easy country for a woman alone." His expression was unreadable. "Why would you stay when you have the chance to go back to civilization?" Delilah didn't have an answer. As they rode back toward Willow Creek, she found herself looking at the landscape differently, seeing not just its harshness, but also its raw beauty. Something about this wild country spoke to a part of her she hadn't known existed, a part that craved open spaces and new beginnings. They were within sight of town when 3 riders appeared on the trail ahead. Xavier's posture changed instantly, his hand moving to rest near his holstered revolver. "Miss Caldwell," he said quietly, "when we approach these men, let me do the talking. Don't make eye contact and stay close to me." Fear fluttered in Delilah's stomach. "Who are they?" "Trouble. The one in the middle is Abe Rawlins. He and his boys have been raiding homesteads north of here." The 3 men spread across the trail, forcing Xavier and Delilah to stop. The middle rider was older, with a face like tanned leather and cold eyes that assessed them with predatory interest. "Wilder," the man acknowledged with a nod. "Long way from town. Just showing the lady her property, Rawlins. We're headed back now." Xavier's voice was casual, but Delilah could sense the tension in him. Rawlins's gaze shifted to Delilah, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "New in town, are you, madam? Don't believe we've been introduced." Before Delilah could respond, Xavier cut in. "Miss Caldwell isn't staying long. Just here to settle some business." "Shame to hear that," Rawlins said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We don't get many new faces around here, especially one so refined." He nodded to his companions. "Boys, make way for the lady and her escort." They moved their horses aside, but as Delilah and Xavier passed, Rawlins called after them. "Miss Caldwell, if you're looking to sell that property by Silver Creek, I might be interested. For the right price." Xavier urged his horse forward without looking back, and Delilah followed his lead. They rode in tense silence until the three men were well behind them. "Who exactly is Abe Rawlins?" Delilah asked when they were close to town. Xavier's jaw was tight. "Used to be a hired gun for the cattle barons up north. Now he runs his own outfit. They steal cattle, raid small homesteads. The law hasn't been able to pin anything on him yet." He glanced at her. "If he's interested in your land, it's not for any good purpose." Back in Willow Creek, Xavier insisted on escorting Delilah to Mrs. Patterson's house. "Don't go anywhere alone while you're here," he advised as they stood on the porch. "And if anyone asks about your plans for the property, be vague. You think Rawlins is dangerous? I know he is." Xavier's eyes scanned the street. "Come by the blacksmith shop tomorrow morning. I want to show you something." Delilah found herself agreeing, curious despite the unease their encounter had left her with. After he'd gone, Mrs. Patterson opened the door, her face creased with concern. "I saw you with Xavier. Did you have any trouble out there?" Delilah explained their encounter with Rawlins as they sat in Mrs. Patterson's cozy kitchen, sipping tea. "That man is a menace," Mrs. Patterson declared. "He's been trying to buy up land all around Willow Creek, especially properties with water rights. Nobody knows exactly why, but it can't be good." Mr. Wilder seemed concerned. "X has good reason to be wary of Rawlins." Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice. 2 years ago, Rawlins and his men burned a homestead north of here. The family barely escaped with their lives. Xavier was the one who found them, brought them to town. That night, Delilah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the small cabin by the creek, how peaceful it had felt despite its neglect. And she thought about Xavier Wilder, with his storm-gray eyes and the scar on his face that spoke of a difficult past. The next morning, she dressed in her brown skirt and shirtwaist again and made her way to the blacksmith shop. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil guided her to a large barn-like structure at the edge of town. Inside, the air was hot and smelled of coal and iron. Xavier stood at an anvil, his powerful arms bare to the shoulder as he hammered a glowing piece of metal. Sweat glistened on his skin, and his face was intensely focused on his work. Delilah paused in the doorway, suddenly aware that she was staring. There was something mesmerizing about watching him work, the controlled strength, the precision of each blow. This was a different Xavier than the trail guide of yesterday, revealing yet another layer to a man she was finding increasingly intriguing. He looked up, caught her watching, and straightened. "Miss Caldwell, give me a moment." He plunged the metal into a water barrel which hissed and steamed, then wiped his hands on a rag and pulled on a clean shirt. "You're the blacksmith," Delilah said, somehow surprised despite the evidence before her. "Among other things." He gestured for her to follow him to a small office at the back of the shop. "I want to show you these." On a cluttered desk lay several maps. Xavier pointed to markings on the largest one. "These are water sources around Willow Creek. And these," he indicated small X's, "are properties Rawlins has bought or driven people off in the last year." Delilah studied the pattern. "He's focusing on land with water access." "Exactly. And your property has one of the best water sources in the area. Silver Creek feeds into the river that supplies the whole valley." Xavier's expression was grim. "There are rumors the railroad's planning a major depot in Willow Creek. If that happens, whoever controls the water controls the town's future. And you think Rawlins wants my land as part of this plan?" "I'm certain of it. That's why I wanted to warn you. If he offers to buy your property, the price might be tempting, but selling to him would hurt a lot of people in the long run." Delilah sat down on a wooden stool, trying to absorb this information. "Mr. Prescott didn't mention any of this." "Prescott's deep in Rawlins's pocket," Xavier said flatly. Half the town is, either through fear or payoffs. What would you do if you were me? Delilah asked, suddenly aware of how much she had come to value his opinion in the short time she'd known him. Xavier leaned against the desk, arms crossed over his chest. Honestly, I'd keep the land. It's good property with a reliable water source. You could build something there. His eyes met hers directly. But I understand you have reasons to go back east. The idea of staying, of making a life in this wild country, had taken root in Delilah's mind. But could she really do it? A woman alone with little money and no experience of frontier life. I need time to think, she said finally. How long can I stay at Mrs. Patterson's? As long as you need, I expect. She enjoys the company. Xavier hesitated. If you're serious about considering staying, I could help with the cabin repairs, get it habitable before winter. His offer touched her. That's very kind, but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition. I owe your father a debt. Delilah blinked in surprise. You knew my father, Xavier nodded slowly. Robert Caldwell. He came out here about 3 years ago, stayed for a month. He helped me when I was in a bad way, lent me money to buy this shop when no one else would take a chance on a former soldier with nothing to his name. He gestured around the blacksmith shop. I've been meaning to pay him back. Never got the chance. He never mentioned. Delilah trailed off, realizing there was much about her father's western adventure she didn't know. He was a good man. Said he had a daughter back east who'd think he was crazy for loving it out here. Xavier's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Sounds like he was right. The revelation that Xavier had known her father, had been helped by him, cast everything in a new light. It wasn't just chance that had brought her to Willow Creek, it was a connection that had existed before she'd ever set foot in the town. I'd like to see the cabin again, Delilah decided suddenly. Really look at it, understanding what it would mean to stay. Xavier nodded. We can ride out tomorrow if you'd like. As Delilah left the blacksmith shop, her mind was whirling with possibilities she hadn't considered before. The prospect of returning to Boston, of trying to rebuild a life there with limited funds and no family, had never been as appealing as she'd pretended. Here, despite the dangers and challenges, she had land, a potential home, and at least one person who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. That evening, as she helped Mrs. Patterson prepare supper, Delilah tentatively broached the subject of staying in Willow Creek. I've been wondering if I might make a go of it here, on my father's land. Mrs. Patterson's hand stilled over the dough she was kneading. It wouldn't be easy, child. Frontier life is hard enough for a family, let alone a woman alone. I know, but in Boston, I'd be just as alone with fewer prospects. The older woman studied her thoughtfully. You've got spirit, I'll give you that, and that land of yours is good despite what some might say. She resumed kneading the dough. Xavier offered to help with repairs, didn't he? Delilah nodded, wondering how Mrs. Patterson had guessed. Thought he might. He's got a soft spot for lost causes. Mrs. Patterson smiled at Delilah's expression. Don't look so offended. We're all lost causes out here in one way or another. That's why we understand each other. The next morning, Xavier was waiting outside Mrs. Patterson's house with the horses already saddled. They rode out to Silver Creek, the journey seeming shorter now that Delilah knew the way. This time, she looked at the land with different eyes, imagining not what it had been but what it could become. At the cabin, Xavier immediately set to work assessing what repairs would be needed. Doors an easy fix. Windows need new glass. Roof solid, but the chimney should be cleaned before you use the fireplace. He pointed to various features as they walked around the small structure. Water's close, which is good. Soil near the creek would be good for a garden. The apple trees just need pruning. You make it sound almost possible, Delilah said, trying to imagine herself living here. It is possible. Xavier looked at her directly. Hard, but possible. Your father believed in this place. They spent the morning exploring the property more thoroughly. Xavier showed her where a chicken coop had once stood, where a small barn could be built, how the natural features of the land could be used to advantage. As they sat by the creek eating lunch, Delilah asked the question that had been on her mind. If I decided to stay, would Rawlins be a problem? Xavier was silent for a moment, his expression serious. Yes, but you wouldn't be facing him alone. Why would you help me? Beyond repaying my father, his eyes met hers, and there was something in them that made her breath catch. Because I believe in what your father saw here. A place worth fighting for. There was more to it than that, Delilah sensed, but she didn't press. They spent the afternoon clearing debris from the cabin and making a list of supplies that would be needed for repairs. By the time they headed back to town, Delilah had nearly made up her mind. I think I'm going to stay, she told Xavier as they approached Willow Creek, at least long enough to give it a fair try. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Your father would be proud, and maybe a little surprised. I'm surprising myself, Delilah admitted. I never thought I'd find anything here worth staying for. The following days fell into a pattern. Delilah would help Mrs. Patterson in the mornings, then ride out to her property with Xavier after he finished his morning work at the blacksmith shop. They cleared the cabin, repaired the door and windows, and cleaned the chimney. Xavier taught her how to prune the apple trees and how to identify edible plants that grew wild on the property. Word spread quickly that Delilah Caldwell was planning to stay and develop her father's land. Most of the townspeople were supportive, offering advice and sometimes supplies. But there were others who watched her with cold calculation, and Delilah knew that news of her decision had reached Abe Rawlins. 2 weeks after her arrival in Willow Creek, as Delilah was returning from the general store with supplies, a man she didn't recognize stepped into her path. Miss Caldwell. His voice was smooth, his clothing too fine for the dusty frontier town. My name is Jenkins. I represent Mr. Rawlins's business interests. Delilah's grip tightened on her package. Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Rawlins would like to make you an offer for your property $700. It's well above market value. The amount was nearly twice what Xavier had suggested the land might be worth. It was enough to set up comfortably back east, to never worry about finances again. Please thank Mr. Rawlins for his generous offer, Delilah replied carefully, but I've decided not to sell. Jenkins's smile thinned. I understand you might have reservations, but Mr. Rawlins is prepared to be even more generous, $800 and safe passage back to Boston. The implication that her safety might otherwise be in question was not lost on Delilah. My decision isn't about the money, Mr. Jenkins. The land was my father's dream, and I intend to honor that. Dreams can be dangerous things, Miss Caldwell. Jenkins touched the brim of his hat. Mr. Rawlins will be disappointed. He doesn't take disappointment well. As he walked away, Delilah fought to control the trembling that had started in her hands. The threat had been clear, if unstated. She found Xavier at the blacksmith shop, hammering out what looked like a plow blade. When he saw her face, he set down his hammer immediately. What happened? Delilah recounted her encounter with Jenkins. Xavier's expression darkened with each word. $800 is a fortune out here, he said when she had finished. Rawlins must be desperate. What do I do now? Xavier wiped his hands on a rag, his movements deliberate. We get you settled on your land as quickly as possible. Establish your presence there. Make it clear you're not going anywhere. You think that will deter Rawlins? No, but it sends a message that you won't be intimidated, and it gives us time to figure out his next move. The next day, Delilah moved her few belongings to the cabin. It was still rough. The floor was bare wood. The furniture consisted of a bed, a table, and 2 chairs that Xavier had helped her acquire, but it was hers. A home. Xavier insisted on staying in a lean-to he constructed near the barn site for the first few nights. "Just until we're sure Rawlins isn't planning anything immediate," he explained. Delilah didn't argue. Though she valued her independence, she wasn't foolish enough to ignore the potential danger. Besides, there was something comforting about knowing Xavier was nearby, about seeing the glow of his campfire through the trees as darkness fell. They settled into a routine. Delilah would cook breakfast, and they would work together on improvements to the property during the day. Xavier would return to town every few days to tend to his blacksmith business, bringing back supplies and news. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk as the sun set, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. Delilah learned that Xavier had grown up in Pennsylvania, had fought for the Union during the war, and had drifted west afterward, unable to settle back into civilian life back east. He'd worked as a scout for the Army, a cattle driver, and finally a blacksmith, finding in the latter a peace that had eluded him since the war. In turn, she told him about her life in Boston, her father's merchant business, and the betrayal by his partner that had left her nearly destitute. She spoke of her mother, who had loved poetry and flowers, and how she'd been raised to expect a certain kind of life that now seemed impossibly distant. "You regret it?" Xavier asked one evening as they watched the first stars appear. "Giving up Boston for this?" Delilah considered the question seriously. "No, there's a freedom here I never had in Boston. Despite everything, the hard work, the uncertainty, even Rawlins, I feel more alive than I ever did there." Xavier's eyes, silvered in the twilight, studied her face. "You're changing. Is that bad?" "No." His voice was soft. "It's remarkable." 3 weeks after Delilah moved to the cabin, they began work on the chicken coop. Xavier had procured lumber from town and was showing Delilah how to use a saw when they heard riders approaching. "Get inside," Xavier said, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "And get your gun." Delilah hurried into the cabin and retrieved the revolver Xavier had insisted she learn to use. Through the window, she watched as 3 riders came into view: Abe Rawlins and 2 of his men. Xavier stood his ground as they approached, his posture relaxed but alert. Delilah couldn't hear the exchange, but she could see Rawlins gesturing toward the cabin, his face set in hard lines. Xavier shook his head, one hand resting casually near his holster. The tension was palpable even from a distance. One of Rawlins's men moved his hand toward his gun, but Rawlins stopped him with a sharp word. After what seemed like an eternity, Rawlins turned his horse and rode away, his men following reluctantly. When they were out of sight, Delilah rushed outside. "What did he say?" Xavier's face was grim. "He made one final offer, $1,000. When I said you weren't selling at any price, he suggested I was getting too attached to damaged goods." Delilah flinched at the crude implication, but Xavier wasn't finished. "He said the town's already talking about how you're living out here with a man, how no respectable woman would do such a thing. Said your reputation was already in tatters, so you might as well take the money and leave." Hot shame flooded Delilah's cheeks, followed quickly by anger. "My reputation, that's what he thinks I care about. It's a weapon he can use against you. In a small town like Willow Creek, rumors can do a lot of damage." Xavier's expression softened. "I should probably stay in town for a while to avoid feeding the gossip." "No." Delilah's response was immediate and fierce. "That's exactly what he wants, to isolate me, make me vulnerable. I won't let him use frontier propriety to chase away my only ally." Xavier studied her face, something like admiration in his eyes. "You're not what I expected, Delilah Caldwell." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sent an unexpected warmth through her. "I'm not what I expected either," she admitted. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Delilah found herself thinking about how much had changed in just a few weeks. She had come to Willow Creek intending to sell her inheritance and flee back to the safety of the East. Now she was fighting to keep that same land, finding in it and in herself a strength she hadn't known she possessed. And then there was Xavier. She glanced at him, his profile strong against the fading light. He had become more than an ally, he was a friend, a teacher, a constant presence she had come to rely on in ways she hadn't anticipated. "You're staring," he said without looking at her, a hint of amusement in his voice. Delilah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was just thinking about how different everything is from what I planned." Now he did turn to look at her, his gray eyes serious in the gathering dusk. "Do you regret staying?" "No, I'm just adjusting to who I'm becoming here." Xavier was silent for a moment. "For what it's worth, I think who you're becoming is someone worth knowing." His words settled around her like a warm blanket, comforting and somehow essential. Before she could respond, he stood and stretched. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow we'll finish the chicken coop, and I'll bring back some hens from town." Delilah watched him walk toward his lean-to, wondering at the complex man who had become so central to her new life. There was a gentleness in him that belied his rough exterior, a depth of feeling that he kept carefully guarded, and something else, a loneliness that mirrored her own. The next morning brought clear skies and unseasonable heat. They worked on the chicken coop, Delilah learning to hammer nails and fit boards under Xavier's patient guidance. By midday, the structure was taking shape, and they paused to rest in the shade of a large pine tree. "You're a quick learner," Xavier observed as they shared water from a canteen. "I have a good teacher." Delilah wiped sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. Her hands were developing calluses, and her skin was tanning from the sun changes that would have horrified her Boston self, but now felt like badges of honor. Xavier's eyes lingered on her face. "There's flour on your cheek," he said, reaching out to brush it away with his thumb. The contact was brief, but Delilah felt it like a physical current running through her. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses, not from the direction of town, but from the north. Xavier was on his feet instantly, hand on his revolver. "Get behind me," he said, his voice low and urgent. 4 riders appeared over the rise, moving fast. As they drew closer, Delilah recognized Jenkins, Rawlins's representative, in the lead. The others were rough-looking men she didn't know. "Stay here," Xavier instructed, moving to intercept the riders before they reached the cabin. Delilah watched as he stood in the path of the oncoming horsemen, forcing them to rein in or ride him down. Jenkins halted his horse a few feet from Xavier, the animal snorting and pawing the ground. "This is private property," Xavier called, his voice carrying clearly on the still air. Jenkins smiled thinly. "We're just passing through, Wilder, on our way to check some of Mr. Rawlins's holdings. Your route to Rawlins's land doesn't cross this property." Xavier's stance was casual, but Delilah could see the tension in his shoulders. "You'll need to go around." Jenkins's smile disappeared. "You're making a mistake, Wilder. This isn't your fight." "I'm making it my fight," Xavier replied, his voice steady. "Now turn around and find another way." For a tense moment, Delilah thought Jenkins would order his men to attack. Instead, he spat on the ground near Xavier's feet. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." As the riders wheeled their horses and departed, Delilah ran to Xavier's side. "What was that about?" "They weren't just passing through, were they?" Xavier's expression was grim. No, they were testing our defenses, seeing how far they could push. He looked down at her, concern evident in his eyes. This is going to get worse before it gets better, Delilah. What do? We prepare. Xavier scanned the property, his mind clearly working through scenarios. And we don't let you stay out here alone, not even for a night. That evening, as darkness fell, Delilah insisted that Xavier take the cabin's one bed while she slept on a pallet by the fireplace. You need proper rest more than I do, she argued when he protested. You can't defend the property if you're exhausted from sleeping on the ground. He finally relented, though he made it clear he wasn't comfortable with the arrangement. Delilah lay awake long after Xavier's breathing had deepened into sleep, listening to the night sounds of her new home and thinking about the danger that seemed to be closing in around them. She had come to love this place, the cabin, the creek, the wild beauty of the land. But was it worth risking her life for? Worth risking Xavier's life? The thought of him being hurt because of her decision to stay sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the night air. In the gray light before dawn, Delilah was awakened by Xavier moving quietly around the cabin, building up the fire and putting coffee on to boil. I need to go into town, he said when he saw she was awake. Get supplies, find out what people are saying. And I want to talk to the sheriff for what that's worth. I'll come with you, Delilah said, sitting up and pushing her hair from her face. Xavier shook his head. Someone needs to stay here. If we both leave, Rawlins's men might take the opportunity to burn the place down or worse. The logic was sound, but Delilah didn't like the idea of Xavier riding into town alone, especially if Rawlins's influence was as widespread as he believed. Be careful, she said finally. After Xavier had gone, Delilah kept herself busy with chores, feeding the few chickens they'd acquired, tending the small garden she'd started, repairing a loose floorboard in the cabin. But her mind kept returning to Xavier and the danger they were facing. What was it about this man that made her willing to risk everything? He was unlike anyone she had known in Boston, rougher, more direct, shaped by hardship and survival in ways that the men of her previous life had never been. Yet there was a core of decency in him, a steadfast integrity that drew her like a compass pointing north. By mid-afternoon, with no sign of Xavier's return, Delilah began to worry. She paced the cabin, then the yard, her eyes constantly scanning the trail that led toward town. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching, she ran to the edge of the clearing, relief flooding through her. But it wasn't Xavier who appeared over the rise. It was Sheriff Davis, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Miss Caldwell," he called as he dismounted. "We've got trouble." Delilah's heart seemed to stop. "Xavier, he's alive," the sheriff said quickly, seeing the fear on her face. "But he's in jail." "Jail? What happened?" Sheriff Davis removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "There was a fight at the saloon. Rawlins's men provoked it, from what witnesses say. One of them pulled a knife on Xavier, and in the struggle the man was badly wounded. Rawlins is pressing charges, claiming Xavier attacked without provocation." "That's ridiculous. Xavier wouldn't." "I know that, Miss Caldwell, but Rawlins has the mayor's ear and half the town council. They're pushing for a quick trial." The sheriff's expression was troubled. "There's talk of making an example of him." Cold fear gripped Delilah. "They can't do that. There must be witnesses, people who saw what really happened. Folks are scared to speak against Rawlins. And those who might are being pressured to leave town or stay silent." Sheriff Davis placed his hat back on his head. "Xavier asked me to come warn you. He thinks Rawlins might make a move on your property while he's locked up." "I need to see him," Delilah said, already moving toward the cabin to gather her things. "That's not wise, Miss Caldwell. Rawlins has men watching the jail. If you come to town, you'll be playing right into his hands." The sheriff hesitated. Xavier said to tell you to sell the land and get out while you can. Said your safety matters more than the property." Delilah stopped in her tracks, the sheriff's words echoing in her mind. Xavier was willing to sacrifice everything, the land he'd helped her improve, his freedom, perhaps even his life, to protect her. "I'm not selling," she said firmly. "And I'm not leaving Xavier to face this alone." Back in the cabin, Delilah changed into her most respectable dress, the blue one she'd worn when she first arrived in Willow Creek, and packed a small bag with essentials. She loaded her revolver and tucked it into a pocket sewn into her skirt, then saddled her horse. The ride to town seemed endless, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. By the time she reached Willow Creek, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street. As the sheriff had warned, there were men loitering near the jail, two rough-looking characters who watched her approach with predatory interest. Delilah lifted her chin and walked past them, ignoring their whispered comments. Inside the jail, she found Sheriff Davis behind a desk, his expression changing from surprise to concern when he saw her. "Miss Caldwell, I told you. I need to see him," Delilah interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The sheriff sighed, then nodded toward a door at the back of the office. "5 minutes. That's all I can give you without raising questions." Xavier was in the only cell, sitting on a narrow cot with his head in his hands. When the door opened, he looked up, his expression changing from resignation to alarm. "Delilah, what the hell are you doing here?" He stood and moved to the bars. "I came to see you," she said, stepping closer. In the dim light of the cell, she could see that his face was bruised, a cut above his eye crusted with dried blood. "You shouldn't have come. It's not safe." His voice was rough with emotion. "Rawlins wants you to sell. If you do that, leave town, they'll drop the charges against me." "Is that what you want me to do?" Delilah asked, searching his face. Xavier gripped the bars, his knuckles white. "What I want doesn't matter. I can't protect you from in here, and I can't bear the thought of you getting hurt because of me. Because of you." Delilah stepped closer, close enough to feel his breath. "This is my fight too, Xavier. My land, my choice to stay and defend it." Something flickered in his eyes, pride, admiration, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Delilah Caldwell. I learned from the best." She reached through the bars to touch his bruised face gently. "I'm not selling, and I'm not leaving you here. We'll find a way through this together." Xavier caught her hand, holding it against his cheek for a moment before releasing it. "There's going to be a hearing tomorrow. Rawlins has the judge in his pocket. I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If things go badly for me, you'll sell the land and go back east, start over." Delilah shook her head. "I can't promise that." "Damn it, Delilah." Xavier's voice was a harsh whisper. "This isn't a game. Rawlins will kill you if that's what it takes to get that land. And what about you? Am I supposed to just leave you to your fate?" Xavier's expression softened. "I've been living on borrowed time since Gettysburg." "But you've got your whole life ahead of you." Before Delilah could respond, the door opened and Sheriff Davis stepped in. "Time's up, Miss Caldwell." Delilah held Xavier's gaze for a moment longer. "This isn't over," she promised, then turned to follow the sheriff. Outside the jail, the street was emptier than before, the town settling in for the night. The saloon's piano could be heard faintly, along with occasional bursts of laughter. "You should get a room at the hotel," Sheriff Davis advised. "It's not safe for you to ride back to your place after dark." "No, I need to speak with Mrs. Patterson first," Delilah replied, her mind already working on a plan. The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue but simply nodded. "Be careful, Miss Caldwell. Rawlins has eyes everywhere." "Mrs. Patterson was surprised to see Delilah at her door but quickly ushered her inside. "I heard about Xavier," she said, her face creased with worry. "It's a shameful business." Over tea, Delilah explained what had happened and what she feared would occur at the hearing. "I need your help, Mrs. Patterson. I need to find people who saw what really happened, who might be willing to speak the truth." The older woman considered this, her hands wrapped around her teacup. "Most folks are afraid, and with good reason. Rawlins has ruined people for less." She took a sip of tea, thinking. "But there might be some who have had enough of his bullying. I'll send word to a few people I trust." Delilah stayed the night at Mrs. Patterson's, sleeping fitfully in the room she had occupied when she first arrived in Willow Creek. It felt like a lifetime ago, though barely a month had passed. She had changed so much in that time, finding a strength and purpose she hadn't known she possessed. And she had found Xavier. The thought of him alone in that cell, facing a corrupt hearing that could end with him hanging, was unbearable. She had to find a way to save him, even if it meant confronting Rawlins directly. Morning brought a flurry of activity as Mrs. Patterson's network of friends and confidants began to arrive. There was Tom Fisher, owner of the general store, who admitted that he had seen Rawlins's men start the fight. Martha Jenkins, the seamstress, whose son had been in the saloon and confirmed Xavier had only defended himself. And surprisingly, Jimmy Ford, the undertaker's son whom Xavier had dismissed as unreliable, who nevertheless offered to testify that he had overheard Rawlins planning to provoke Xavier into a fight. By noon, when the hearing was set to begin, Delilah had gathered 7 witnesses willing to speak the truth. It wasn't many in a town the size of Willow Creek, but it was a start. The hearing was held in the town hall, a simple building that served multiple purposes for the community. When Delilah entered with her small group of witnesses, she could feel the tension in the room. Rawlins sat near the front, his face impassive as he watched her approach. Xavier was already there, standing before Judge Harmon with his hands shackled. Delilah's heart twisted at the sight of him, proud and defiant despite his bonds. When he saw her and the people with her, his eyes widened slightly, and she thought she saw a flicker of hope cross his face. Judge Harmon, a thin man with spectacles and a permanent frown, called the hearing to order. "We're here to determine if there's sufficient cause to try Xavier Wilder for the attempted murder of Samuel Jenkins, an employee of Mr. Abe Rawlins." The proceedings began with Rawlins's account of events, a carefully constructed tale of Xavier attacking without provocation, supposedly fueled by personal animosity toward Rawlins and his men. 2 of Rawlins's employees corroborated the story, their testimonies almost identical in wording. When it was Xavier's turn to speak, he told a different story of Rawlins's men surrounding him in the saloon, of threats made against Delilah and her property, of the knife that was pulled only after Xavier refused to be intimidated. "And why should this court believe your version of events over Mr. Rawlins's?" Judge Harmon asked, his tone making it clear where his sympathies lay. "Because there are witnesses who saw the truth," Delilah said, standing up from her seat. "Honest citizens of Willow Creek who are tired of being bullied into silence." A murmur ran through the room as one by one, the witnesses Delilah had gathered stood and offered their accounts. Their stories varied in details, but aligned on the key points. Xavier had been defending himself, and Rawlins's men had initiated the confrontation. Judge Harmon's frown deepened with each testimony. Rawlins's expression had hardened into a mask of controlled fury. When the last witness had spoken, the judge removed his spectacles and pinched the bridge of his nose. "This complicates matters," he said finally. "I'll need time to consider, if I may, Your Honor." Delilah stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. There's something else the court should know. Mr. Rawlins has been attempting to force me to sell my property through intimidation and threats. This incident was simply his latest attempt to remove Mr. Wilder, who has been helping me improve my land. These are serious allegations, Miss Caldwell, the judge said, his tone cautious. They're true, Sheriff Davis spoke up from the back of the room. I've had reports of Rawlins's men trespassing on Miss Caldwell's property, making threats. I was there when they tried to force their way through just yesterday. Judge Harmon looked increasingly uncomfortable. The hearing was not going as planned, and Delilah could see him weighing his loyalties to Rawlins against the public scrutiny now focused on the proceedings. Your Honor, Xavier said, his voice calm and measured, I ask only for a fair judgment based on the truth, not on who has the most influence in this town. The room fell silent as the judge considered. Finally, he cleared his throat. In light of the testimony presented, I find insufficient evidence to hold Mr. Wilder for trial. The charges are dismissed. Relief washed over Delilah so powerfully that she had to grab the back of a chair to steady herself. Xavier's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his expression remained guarded. Rawlins stood abruptly, his chair scraping the wooden floor. This isn't over, he said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the silent room. His eyes found Delilah's, not by a long shot. As people began to file out of the town hall, Sheriff Davis unlocked Xavier's shackles. Watch your back, Wilder, he advised quietly. Rawlins isn't a man who forgives being crossed. Xavier rubbed his wrists where the shackles had chafed the skin. His eyes sought Delilah, who was accepting the thanks and good wishes of those who had testified on his behalf. When they were finally able to speak privately, Xavier took Delilah's hands in his. You shouldn't have done that, he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only concern. You've made yourself an even bigger target. I couldn't let them hang you for defending yourself, Delilah replied, and I'm tired of being afraid of Rawlins. Xavier searched her face, his expression softening. You are the most remarkable woman I've ever known, Delilah Caldwell. Something in the way he said it made her heart beat faster. Before she could respond, Mrs. Patterson joined them, her face lined with worry. You two shouldn't stay in town tonight, she said, keeping her voice low. Rawlins is furious, and there's talk of his men getting drunk at the saloon making threats. We'll head back to the cabin, Xavier decided. It's more defensible than any place in town. The ride back to Silver Creek was tense, both of them scanning the landscape for signs of pursuit. But they reached the cabin without incident as the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. I'll check the perimeter, Xavier said as they dismounted. Make sure no one's been here while we were gone. While he circled the property, Delilah went inside to start a fire and prepare a simple meal from the supplies they had on hand. The familiar tasks helped calm her nerves, though she couldn't shake the feeling that their confrontation with Rawlins was far from over. When Xavier returned, he reported that everything seemed untouched. But we should take precautions. I'll sleep outside tonight, keep watch. No, Delilah said firmly. You need proper rest after being in that cell. We can take turns keeping watch if necessary, but you're not sleeping outside. Xavier looked like he wanted to argue but eventually nodded. I'll take first watch then. They ate in companionable silence, both too exhausted for conversation. Afterward, Xavier checked his revolver while Delilah cleared away the dishes. Thank you, he said suddenly, his voice low. For believing in me, for gathering those witnesses. Not many would have taken that risk. Delilah looked at him across the small cabin, this man who had become so important to her in such a short time. You would have done the same for me. Yes, he agreed simply. I would. The weight of unspoken feelings hung between them. a tension that had been building since that first day when he'd helped her with her trunk. Delilah found herself wanting to cross the room, to touch his face, to tell him how much he had come to mean to her. But fear not of rejection, but of the intensity of her own feelings held her back. "You should get some sleep," Xavier said finally, breaking the moment. "I'll wake you in a few hours for your watch." Delilah nodded and retreated to the bedroom, leaving the door ajar. Sleep eluded her, her mind too full of the day's events and the uncertain future that lay ahead. What would Rawlins do next? How long could they hold out against his determination to possess her land? And what of her feelings for Xavier? In Boston, a relationship with someone like him would have been unthinkable. A former soldier turned blacksmith, with rough hands and a scarred face. Yet here, in this wild country where a person was judged by their actions rather than their background, she had found in him a strength and integrity that surpassed any man she had known before. She must have dozed off eventually because she woke with a start to the sound of Xavier's voice, urgent and low. "Delilah, wake up. There's riders coming." She was instantly alert, reaching for her revolver on the bedside table. "How many?" "At least 6, maybe more. They've got torches." Xavier's face was grim in the dim light of the single lamp he had lit. "Rawlins is making his move." Fear coursed through her, but Delilah forced it down. "What do? "We need to make a stand." Xavier checked his revolver. "I've got a rifle and extra ammunition." "The cabin walls are solid logs. They can't burn it easily if we keep them at a distance." Delilah's mind raced. 6 armed men against the 2 of them were bad odds, even with the protection of the cabin walls. "Is there anyone who could help us?" "The sheriff." "Too far. By the time anyone from town got here, it would be over." Xavier's eyes met hers, his gaze steady. "We can try to hold out till dawn. If we can make it expensive enough for them, Rawlins might decide the land isn't worth the cost." It was a slim hope, but it was all they had. Delilah nodded and began to dress quickly, pulling on her skirt and shirtwaist over her nightgown. Xavier positioned himself at the front window, rifle ready. "They're coming up the main trail, slow, like they're not worried about surprise." Delilah joined him, peering through the darkness at the approaching torches. "They think we're asleep. That gives us some advantage." "Take position at the back window," Xavier instructed. "They'll try to surround the cabin. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot, and don't waste ammunition." As Delilah moved to the rear window, revolver in hand, Xavier called after her softly. "Delilah." When she turned, his expression was intense. "No matter what happens, I want you to know that meeting you, helping you build this place, it's been the best thing in my life for a long time." The simple honesty of his words struck her deeply. "For me too," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no time for more as the riders came into the clearing, their torches casting eerie shadows against the trees. Delilah could make out Rawlins in the lead, his face set in hard lines visible even in the flickering light. "Wilder," Rawlins called. "I know you're in there. Come out and bring the woman. We need to settle this once and for all." Xavier didn't respond, his rifle steady as he tracked Rawlins through the window. "I'm offering you one last chance, Miss Caldwell," Rawlins continued, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Sell me the land and you can both ride out of here unharmed. Refuse, and I can't guarantee your safety." Delilah looked to Xavier, who shook his head slightly. They both knew Rawlins couldn't be trusted, that even if she agreed to sell, there was no guarantee they would leave this clearing alive. "My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Rawlins," Delilah called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "This land isn't for sale, not to you, not to anyone." Rawlins's face contorted with anger. "Then you've made your choice." He signaled to his men, "Burn them out." The riders began to circle the cabin, torches held high. Two dismounted and approached with bundles of kindling, clearly intending to set fire to the porch. "Now," Xavier said quietly, and fired. His shot caught one of the men in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. Delilah aimed at the second man with the kindling and fired, her shot going wide but causing him to dive for cover. Chaos erupted as Rawlins's men returned fire, bullets thudding into the cabin walls and shattering one of the windows. Xavier moved smoothly from window to window, firing with precision, keeping the attackers at a distance. Delilah reloaded her revolver, her hands shaking slightly but her determination undiminished. When a man appeared at her window, torch in hand, she fired without hesitation, catching him in the arm. He dropped the torch and fell back, cursing. The exchange of gunfire continued, minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Delilah lost track of time, focused only on defending their home. She was vaguely aware that Xavier had been grazed by a bullet, a streak of blood on his sleeve, but he continued to fight without complaint. Just when it seemed they might be able to hold out until dawn, a new threat emerged. Through the back window, Delilah saw two of Rawlins's men approaching with a barrel, rolling it toward the cabin. "Xavier," she called. "They have something at the back, a barrel." Xavier joined her at the window, his expression grim. "Kerosene, most likely. They're going to try to douse the cabin, then set it alight." Before either of them could fire, a new sound cut through the night, multiple riders approaching fast from the direction of town. Rawlins and his men heard it too, their attack faltering as they turned to face this new development. Sheriff Davis rode into the clearing, rifle in hand, followed by at least 10 men from Willow Creek: Tom Fisher, Jimmy Ford, and others who had testified at Xavier's hearing, along with several Delilah didn't recognize. "That's enough, Rawlins," the sheriff called. "Drop your weapons, all of you." For a tense moment, it seemed Rawlins might order his men to fight. But outnumbered and with several of his gang already wounded, he finally raised his hands in surrender. "This isn't over, Caldwell," he shouted toward the cabin as the sheriff's posse disarmed him and his men. "You'll never be safe here." Delilah and Xavier emerged cautiously from the cabin, weapons still ready. Sheriff Davis approached them, his expression grim but satisfied. "Mrs. Patterson sent word," he explained. "Said you two might need help. Seems she was right." "Thank you, Sheriff," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "You arrived just in time." As dawn broke over Silver Creek, Rawlins and his men were bound and loaded onto horses for the journey back to Willow Creek, where they would face charges of attempted murder and arson. The sheriff promised that this time, with multiple witnesses to their crimes, not even Rawlins's influence could save them. The townspeople who had come to their aid helped repair the broken window and clear the debris of the attack before heading back, many of them promising to return to help with further improvements to the property. When they were finally alone, Delilah and Xavier sat on the porch steps, watching the sun rise fully over the eastern hills. They were exhausted, dirty, and in Xavier's case, wounded but alive and victorious. "Why did you stay?" Xavier asked suddenly. "After everything, Rawlins, the danger, nearly being killed. Why not take the money and go back to Boston?" Delilah considered the question, looking out over the land that had become so precious to her. "At first, I stayed because it was my father's dream and I wanted to honor that. Then I stayed because I refused to be bullied by Rawlins." She turned to look at Xavier, finding the courage to say what had been in her heart. "But mostly, I stayed because of you." Xavier's breath caught. "Delilah, you showed me what this place could be," she continued, not letting him interrupt. "What I could be. Strong, independent, building something with my own hands. You never once made me feel that I couldn't do this because I was a woman or because I came from the East. You just..." believed in me." Xavier reached out, his rough hand gently cupping her cheek. "How could I not? You're the most extraordinary person I've ever known." Delilah leaned into his touch, her heart racing. "When Rawlins's men called me names, spread rumors about me living out here with you, I should have cared more about my reputation. But all I could think was that I'd rather be here with you than respected and alone back in Boston." Something shifted in Xavier's eyes, a barrier falling, a decision made. "When I first met you, I thought you were just another Eastern lady who'd run back to civilization at the first sign of hardship. I've never been more glad to be wrong." He leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips, giving her the chance to pull back. Instead, Delilah closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that felt like coming home. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Delilah Caldwell. I think I have since that day by the creek when you asked if pain ever gets easier to bear." "I love you too," Delilah whispered, the words feeling natural and right. "And I want to build a life here with you." Xavier smiled, a rare, unguarded expression that transformed his face. "Then let's build something that will last." In the weeks that followed, news spread that Rawlins and his men had been sentenced to prison for their crimes. Without their leader, the remnants of Rawlins's organization quickly disbanded, many leaving the territory entirely. The railroad did indeed establish a depot in Willow Creek, bringing new prosperity to the town. But the water rights that Rawlins had coveted ended up benefiting the entire community, as Delilah and Xavier worked with the town council to ensure fair access for all local ranchers and farmers. Xavier proposed to Delilah on a warm summer evening as they sat on the porch of their now thriving homestead. The cabin had been expanded, the chicken coop was full of laying hens, and the apple orchard was beginning to recover under their care. "I don't have much to offer you," he said, holding out a simple silver ring. "No fancy house or fine clothes, just my hands, my heart, and a promise to build our dream together." "That's all I want," Delilah replied, tears of joy in her eyes as she accepted the ring. "Just you and this land and the life we're making." They were married in the autumn, with the aspen trees turning gold against the mountainsides. Mrs. Patterson hosted the celebration in her backyard, the entire town turning out to wish them well. Even Delilah's father's old business partner sent a letter of apology and a wedding gift, having heard of her new life through mutual acquaintances in Boston. As the years passed, their homestead flourished. Xavier's blacksmith business expanded to include a small foundry, supplying metal parts for the growing railroad network. Delilah, drawing on her father's merchant background, opened a trading post that became known for fair prices and quality goods. They had children, 2 boys and a girl who grew strong and free in the western air, learning both their father's practical skills and their mother's Eastern education. The cabin became a proper house, though they kept the original structure as the heart of their home, a reminder of where they had started. 10 years after Delilah had stepped off the stagecoach in Willow Creek, she sat with Xavier on their porch, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set behind the mountains. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked, echoing the question he had asked her years before. "Giving up Boston for this?" Delilah looked at the life they had built together, the thriving homestead, their beautiful children, the community that had grown around them. And most of all, the man beside her, his hair now streaked with silver but his storm-gray eyes still bright with love for her. "Never," she said, taking his hand. "Not for a single moment." Xavier smiled and pulled her close. "When we first met, you were so determined to go back east. What changed your mind?" Delilah thought back to those early days, to the fear and uncertainty that had gradually given way to belonging and purpose. I came to Willow Creek thinking I knew who I was, a Boston merchant's daughter with no place in the Wild West. But you saw something else in me, something stronger and braver than I knew existed. I just saw you, Xavier said simply. The real you beneath all those Eastern manners. Delilah leaned against his shoulder, remembering the day that had changed everything. Do you recall what I told you about the rumors in town? How they called me filthy for living out here with you? Xavier nodded, his arm tightening around her. I remember. You whispered to me that night, then let me show you what pure feels like. And you did. Delilah looked up at him, love shining in her eyes. Not just with a kiss or a touch, but with your belief in me, in us, in what we could build together. Xavier kissed her then, a kiss as full of promise and tenderness as their first had been. Around them, their home stood strong against the coming night, a testament to the love that had transformed a Boston merchant's daughter and a scarred veteran into pioneers of a new life, one built with their own hands, rooted in the soil of Silver Creek, and nurtured by a love as vast and enduring as the western sky.